Okay. Yeah, my talk's about virtual poetics. This is going to be a very abstract talk. That's why I'm calling it a thought experiment. But yeah, we'll see where it goes. So I want to start with pointing to a possible tension in the project of distant reading. This is a tension between it's sort of two types of discourse. There's a revolutionary discourse within distant reading and DH more broadly. So, this is a new scale of analysis. We're working with thousands of texts potentially. This is a new precision of analysis. We're tracking, individual word frequencies. It opens up the possibility of empirical claims, the order order of the fact, and effectively we're making possible new forms of literary study. So this is pretty revolutionary. On the other hand, new data is very often explained in terms of old hypotheses. So on the other hand, there might not be new knowledge actually. And that literary history is often sort of an unexamined central focus. So you can imagine these trend lines that I'll show you in a second with a single trend line, a kind of old model of historiography. So in a sense, is there a new method? So here's actually work that I've done in the past. I'm going to critique for a second. So this is actually the 19th century novel. These are about 3,000 British novels. And what you're seeing is the rise of particular parts of words. So these are action verbs, body parts, concrete nouns, etc. Huge data transformation here. Huge trend, but how do we interpret it? Really the rise of narrative realism, or rise of showing, not telling. This is something that we theoretically already knew. The mechanism is that urbanization is happening. We sort of already knew that as well. And so, when we have these giant historical trends, we end up sort of reaching around for giant historical phenomena that we know already to exist, and then explain the data in terms of the theory. But the data doesn't really come back and problematize the theory, is the charge here. And I want to ask why that is, and I want to make an even more abstract point about how there might be two types of counting or two types of quantitativeness going on in DH. So one is that in order to count anything, it has to be plural, right? In order for something to be plural, it has to repeat. So there's a sense in which we can't count texts themselves because they don't repeat. A passage, we think about a text as a passage. A passage is radically singular, right? But features of texts do. So words, parts of speech, these are the things. That's why we count them and not texts themselves, right? But let's say I tell you that 11% of the words in Moby Dick are verbs. Is that meaningful? So not really, right? Because numbers only become meaningful when we compare them with other numbers. So numerical meaning is sort of generated when we compare a number in one text with numbers in many other texts. But how do we choose which text to compare those to? What's the lens of comparison? And that's where metadata often comes in, right? So we often compare, how is Melville different from other authors? How is this genre different from this other genre? How is the late 19th century different from the early 19th century? But the problem with that is that does the lens become the cause? And we can think about this in our own moment. We often hear about psychology research where we compare female and male brains, and we know that more activity is going on in this part of the female brain. And there might be a temptation to say that femaleness is causing this difference. But is that a moment at which the lens, the comparative lens, which gives meaning to the data, we sort of overinterpret it and reify it and make it also the cause of that data? And that's why I'm worried that these trends that I was looking at a second ago, are we sort of returning to a kind of historical determinism, where the only thing that matters is the x-axis of time? Not genders, not races, not nationalities, nothing matters except where you are on this chart in terms of the x-axis. So that's the danger. So, but how do we do it differently, right? Well, maybe one way is that instead of comparing a text with other actual texts, maybe we can compare a text with itself. But that's a problem, right? Because we need multiple texts in order to do that. But not to get even more abstract, but Deleuze talks about how the way in which something differs from itself is its virtuality. So maybe we can think about comparing something with its own virtual permutations. Maybe we can make more text out of a single text. But I don't know. So anyway, this is a little experiment. Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, right? There's this many unique words in the sonnets, this many unique word-word pairs. We can think about a Markov model, which is a way to navigate those bigrams. So if you think about shall I, in the actual sonnets, shall I is followed by this many words. Now we can just sort of start from here and sort of pick one of these randomly, and then keep doing that. You can see how this is going to telescope up quite quickly. In fact, if you look at this sequence of 10 syllables, if you start from shall I, so this is one virtual possibility which happens to be actualized. if you start from shall I and go 10 syllables out in those networks, there's actually a million possibilities that you can reach. And so really the actual is like, that small percentage of the virtual space. So with that, we can sort of make virtual sonnets. So here are the rules. That you have to follow this Markov chain throughout the poem. So you start from some seed, and you keep going throughout. Yeah, it's fitting actually somehow. Yeah, so this is not really a rule. It's just the enabling constraint. You start from some seed, and you just keep following that networks until you get 10 lines. Each line has to be 10 syllables. They have to rhyme in Shakespearean sonnet form. And this is just a constraint saying that no one virtual sonnet can have a line that another virtual sonnet had. So can anyone guess how many sonnets we can make? I can't either. It's really big. It's already 20,000. It seems limitless. I thought there would be a number. That's already the first thing that I realized is probably not true. So here's an example. So this is starting from the seed O comma. I thought this was cute, just this virtual apostrophe. You just say O comma and you go into this virtual void. But oh, it shall be, as this will be, thy widow, and still weep that thou and this alone. Blah, blah, blah. So you can see, this doesn't make much sense, but you rhyme be, see, this, kiss, and etc. Prayers and affairs, not bad, right? So this is if we go back to the brain metaphor for a second, effectively we have Shakespeare with parts of his brain removed. And we've removed certain determinants in the way that Shakespeare has made his sonnets. We've basically removed the determinant of aesthetics and semantics. These don't really make sense, and there's no aesthetic quality to them, but they're formally, minimally consistent with the sonnet. So that we've removed certain forces, and if we think about force and form as synonymous, we remove certain forces, and we want to see what forms result when we do that. And to do that, I wanted to put the virtual sonnets on like a morpho space with the real sonnet. So this is a space that I worked on with JD and other graduate students at Stanford on a poetry project where the x-axis here is how many ternary feet in the poem there are, and the y-axis is basically whether the rhythm is generally rising or falling. So this top left corner is where a perfect iambic poem would be. So there's no ternary feet, and it's perfectly rising in rhythm. And the blue is where Shakespeare's real sonnets are, and the orange are these virtual sonnets. And I was surprised by this because I thought that I was playing with this phrase, the virtual landscape, because I was hoping that the virtual would surround the real and would recontextualize the real. And I thought that there'd be poems in all four of these quadrants, effectively, because there's so many of them. You would imagine that just randomly you would get poems in these various corners. But for some reason you don't get that. And basically what this is showing us is that Shakespeare wrote iambic poems more than we would expect if you take away the forces of aesthetics and semantics, which is maybe, doesn't tell us all that much new. We knew that Shakespeare wrote that, but I think, basically this is more of a thought experiment methodologically, just saying, what can we do when we sort of tinker around with a brain, removing certain regions, removing certain forces, and seeing what forms result. And so just lastly, I want to kind of invert this and look at where these virtual sonnets fit in a larger, more historical space. So this is a different kind of space. This is basically, you have Lewis Carroll up here. So you have, this is this x-axis is poems that are sort of sing-songy and are perfectly regular in their metrics. And here you have higher hood distance. So the higher you are here, the more you are in one of those previous corners. So you have people like Byron, Lewis Carroll, Cooper, Gray up here, and you have people like Ginsberg, E. Cummings, etc. down here. Shakespeare's real sonnets are here, but what's interesting is that the virtual sonnets are not really next to Shakespeare. They're next to Whitman and Wallace Stevens. So it's a certain kind of free verse that the virtual Shakespeare is doing. But it's not the kind of free verse that Ginsberg is doing. I looked at that. I looked at it. Ginsberg has these poems with like six stresses in a row. These very, very clash-heavy poems that would be difficult to get using the forces, these random forces that these virtual sonnets are doing. So I think that possibly this kind of virtual Shakespeare can even help us understand something like Whitman and Stevens, because we might think about the forces that determine their forms as being closer to the forces that are determining these virtual sonnets. And just lastly, I want to make this critical point that I think, even though this seems, the virtual textuality seems even more pointless of a formalism than real formalism, I think that, this is a space of predominantly, white men that create possibly what we might understand of as the space of possibilities for poetic form. And I think, another way to trouble that, a kind of like virtual way to trouble that, is to create, using virtual means, a broader space of possibilities in which to situate the history of poetry within, to make that seem more contingent and rather than less contingent. So, okay, that's it.
So we have 3 minutes left before the respondent. If we want to take a question or two from the audience, anyone has any thoughts or reactions about this? Go ahead, Alan.
Well, I really like the metaphor of removing parts of Shakespeare's brain. Do you have any possible plans or ideas for actually collaborating with cognitive psychologists in order to fine tweak the parts of the brain that you want to remove? Are there language problems or pathologies of certain kinds that might lead you to think that structural features in the algorithmic process might actually reflect some kind of reality in the thinking process?
Yeah, so far it's just been a metaphor, but that makes it literal in a very interesting way, because you could think about, I showed those rules, and basically the form that results from these virtual texts is going to be radically dependent on what rules you create. And I think finding a way, maybe through psychological research, to find rules that sort of already tell us something about cognition. So for instance, I know there are some rules that say that you can only contain so much information in your brain at a time. So maybe you could find some way to sort of program that in and say, like, this is a type of language that recurs onto a topic every so many words so as to maximize memory. This is a type of rule that works against that, and see what types of textuality emerge. So I think there could be an interesting dovetail there. Yeah.
I'm curious that thinking backwards from your Markov model.
Yeah.
Supposing you hooked this up to machine learning, and you said, given a Markov model of all of the possible Shakespeare, what are the formalisms we could introduce on top of a random Markov walker that might make it more likely as opposed to less likely to hit actual Shakespeare poems or sequences?
Right.
Is there a way in which the virtual framework here, is not all of the choices that Shakespeare or any author function is making in language are easily formalizable,
right,
but some of them might be. Could you imagine a kind of a learning or feedback version of this that would discover formalisms that relate to author functions?
Absolutely. I think in making these sonnets, I kept thinking about what other types of rules you could create to get closer to Shakespeare. So, Shakespeare basically doesn't enjam. There's probably a way to study. It's not that he has a punctuation at the end of every line, but he doesn't end a line on a preposition or a pronoun. And you start to realize these rules when you're thinking in a more generative point of view. What do I need to tweak in order to get the type of responses that are in Shakespeare? So I think that's one approach to virtuality and modeling, is a more predictive one, or a more generative one, where you're trying to sort of recreate the conditions of possibility that you need in order to get at this particular text.
It's really interesting to count the minimum number of rules one needs to create a Shakespeare poem as opposed to someone else's poem.
Right.
Or get in the neighborhood, right?
Right.
Well, thank you. Our respondent will stay, but I think that's it for our time in this session. We have one last, thank you again.